When an racist woman at the airport questions how an interracial couple could afford first-class tickets, her prejudice sets off a shocking confrontation mid-flight. But as the truth unfolds, she's left humiliated in front of the entire cabin. This is a powerful tale of resilience, love, and the ultimate triumph of character over ignorance. The airport terminal was alive with the chaotic energy of a busy morning. The buzz of announcements, the rolling clatter of suitcases, and the excited chatter of travelers filled the air. Among the sea of passengers, Michael and Sarah Taylor navigated their way toward the gate, their hands loosely clasped as they moved in sync. Michael, a tall black man with a quiet strength about him, walked at an easy pace, his deep brown eyes lighting up as Sarah leaned in to whisper something that made him chuckle. Sarah, his wife, was a lively, confident white woman whose humor was as quick as her wit. The couple was celebrating their 5th anniversary with a long overdue vacation, one that had taken years of hard work and careful planning to make happen. "I still can't believe we snagged those first-class tickets," Sarah said, her blue eyes twinkling. "We're practically living the dream." Michael grinned. "Hey, you deserve it. Besides, this time we're going in style." Their light-hearted banter carried them to the gate, where a growing line of passengers waited to board. The overhead sign flashed brightly, "First class boarding soon." Michael pulled out their boarding passes, tucking them into his jacket pocket as Sarah playfully nudged him. "Don't lose those," she teased. "This is too good to mess up." But their moment of joy was interrupted. Standing a few feet away was Linda Carter, a woman in her mid-50s with an air of entitlement that seemed to radiate from her posture. Dressed in a crisp beige blazer and carrying an expensive designer bag, Linda's sharp gray eyes darted toward the couple. Her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line as she took in the sight of Michael and Sarah. She leaned toward the passenger next to her, muttering loud enough to ensure her words carried. "Can you believe some people? They'll let anyone into first class these days." Sarah froze mid-laugh, her smile faltering as the words reached her ears. Michael's posture stiffened, but he kept his expression neutral, his years of experience in dealing with similar situations teaching him to stay calm. Linda, emboldened by the couple's lack of response, continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "I mean, it's obvious they don't belong. Probably some kind of giveaway or charity deal. Ridiculous." Sarah turned to Michael, her face tight with discomfort. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice low but edged with anger. "I did," Michael replied, his tone steady. He gently squeezed her hand. "Ignore it, Sarah. It's not worth it." But Linda wasn't finished. She shifted her stance, ensuring she was now directly in the couple's line of sight. "Some of us worked hard to be here," she added, her tone sharper. "It's not just handed out to anyone." Michael took a slow breath, his calm exterior masking the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He glanced at Sarah, whose cheeks were flushed with anger. "It's okay," he said softly. "Let it go." "I don't know if I can," Sarah whispered back, her voice trembling with indignation. Passengers around them began to take notice. A few exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to intervene. Others simply avoided eye contact, their faces reflecting a mix of discomfort and curiosity. The gate agent's voice cut through the tension, announcing that first-class boarding would begin shortly. Michael turned to Sarah, offering a small smile. "Come on, let's just get on the plane and enjoy our trip." As the couple stepped forward, Linda's muttering grew louder. "Of course they're pushing their way to the front. Typical," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. This time, Sarah couldn't stay silent. She stopped abruptly, turning to face Linda. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. "Do you have a problem?" Linda raised an eyebrow, her smirk widening. "Not at all," she said, her tone icy. "Just commenting on how standards seem to be slipping these days." Michael gently placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, a silent reminder to let it go. Sarah hesitated but nodded, taking a deep breath. They handed their boarding passes to the gate agent, who smiled warmly and motioned them toward the jet bridge. Linda watched them go, her eyes narrowing as she grumbled under her breath. As Michael and Sarah disappeared down the walkway, Linda crossed her arms, muttering to herself, "This flight is going to be a joke." What Linda didn't know, however, was that her assumptions were about to be shattered in the most unexpected way. Michael and Sarah stood near the first-class boarding line, their anticipation for the trip slightly dampened by the tension lingering in the air. Sarah clutched Michael's arm tightly, her fingers pressing against his jacket as they waited for the gate agent's announcement. She was doing her best to brush off Linda's snide remarks, but her patience was wearing thin. Behind them, Linda Carter stood with her arms crossed, her sharp gaze locked onto the couple. Her lips curled into a smirk as she watched them, her voice cutting through the low hum of the terminal. "You're in the wrong line," Linda said loudly, her words directed at Michael and Sarah but designed to catch the attention of everyone around them. Michael glanced at Sarah, silently urging her to stay calm, then turned to Linda. "We're exactly where we're supposed to be," he said evenly, his tone polite but firm. Linda scoffed, her expression turning incredulous. "Really? First class? You expect me to believe that?" Passengers nearby began to glance over, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. Some exchanged uncomfortable looks, while others watched openly, their faces a mixture of shock and interest. "First class is for people who can actually afford it," Linda sneered, her voice dripping with disdain. "Not for charity cases." Sarah felt her chest tighten, a mix of anger and disbelief flooding her senses. She took a step forward, her blue eyes blazing. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice rising slightly. But before she could say more, Michael gently touched her arm, stopping her. "Sarah, don't," he said softly, his voice calm but resolute. Michael turned his attention back to Linda, meeting her gaze with a steady calm that only seemed to fuel her indignation. "Ma'am, I think it's best if you focus on your own travel plans and let us focus on ours," he said. Linda's laugh was cold and humorless. "Oh, don't get defensive," she said, her tone mocking. "I'm just pointing out what everyone here is probably thinking. First class isn't for everyone, you know." Linda's volume grew louder, her condescending tone echoing across the terminal. "What did you do? Win a radio contest? Or maybe someone felt sorry for you and handed over their tickets?" Sarah's fists clenched at her sides, her breathing shallow as she tried to contain her anger. "You have no idea who we are or what we've done," she said through gritted teeth. "And I don't need to," Linda snapped back. "It's written all over you." The exchange caught the attention of the gate agent, a young woman with a professional demeanor, who quickly approached the group. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice calm but assertive. Before Michael or Sarah could respond, Linda interjected. "No problem. I was just pointing out that some people don't understand how boarding works. First class is supposed to be exclusive, and I'm not sure how these two ended up here." The gate agent blinked, her polite smile faltering as she glanced at Michael and Sarah. "Sir, ma'am, may I see your boarding passes, please?" Michael handed over their tickets without hesitation, his steady demeanor unshaken by Linda's antics. The gate agent scanned the passes and nodded, her professional smile returning. "You're all set for first class. Enjoy your flight." "Thank you," Michael said, his tone calm but pointed, as if daring Linda to say more. Linda, however, wasn't finished. "This is ridiculous," she said, throwing her hands up in exasperation. "They probably use some discount website or vouchers. First class isn't what it used to be if just anyone can waltz in." "Ma'am," the gate agent said firmly, her patience clearly wearing thin, "I need you to lower your voice and step aside. You're causing a disruption." Linda's face turned red, but she refused to back down. "I'm not causing a disruption. I'm pointing out the obvious. Standards are slipping, and it's not fair to those of us who've earned the right to be here." Sarah finally broke her silence, her voice steady but full of fire. "Earned the right? Are you kidding me? You don't know anything about us or how hard we've worked. But here's a tip. If you want to know what doesn't belong in first class, it's your attitude." Michael placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's back, his calm energy grounding her. "Let's just board, Sarah. She's not worth it." The gate agent nodded, motioning for Michael and Sarah to proceed down the jet bridge. As they walked away, Michael gave Linda one last look, a measured, steady gaze that spoke volumes without saying a word. Linda stood rooted to the spot, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for a retort. Passengers around her whispered, some shaking their heads in disapproval. One woman murmured to her companion, "Unbelievable. I hope they enjoy their flight. They handled that better than I would have." Linda, still fuming, turned to glare at the gate agent. "You'll be hearing from me about this," she said, her voice full of indignation. But the agent simply smiled politely and gestured toward the boarding line. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am." As Linda reluctantly stepped into the line, the atmosphere in the terminal shifted. The spectators dispersed, and the drama subsided. But for Michael and Sarah, the encounter was far from over. On board the plane, their seats awaited them, a comfortable refuge in the first-class cabin. Little did Linda know that her assumptions were about to be shattered in ways she never expected. As Linda Carter tapped her manicured nails impatiently on the handle of her designer bag, her sharp gaze remained fixed on Michael and Sarah. Beneath her veneer of composure was an unshakable sense of entitlement, rooted in a life of privilege. Linda was the daughter of an oil magnate, raised in sprawling estates and private schools where exclusivity was a currency. Her parents had instilled in her the belief that wealth was a birthright, not something earned, and that people like her were destined to occupy spaces others could only dream of. She often prided herself on her ability to read people, to decide within seconds whether they belonged in her world. To Linda, appearances were everything. Michael and Sarah didn't fit her narrow definition of who belonged in first class. The thought of them sharing her space offended her deeply, though she would never admit, even to herself, how much of that judgment was fueled by her biases. Nearby, Michael sat with Sarah, quietly observing Linda's growing agitation. He didn't need to hear every word she said to understand her assumptions. They were written all over her face. Her sharp stares, her haughty tone, the way she whispered just loud enough to be overheard. Michael leaned back in his chair, his calm demeanor masking the memories her behavior stirred. He thought of the countless times he had been underestimated, judged for the color of his skin or the way he carried himself. From the cashier who assumed he couldn't afford what was in his cart to the coworker who questioned his promotion, Michael had faced discrimination in many forms. Yet, he had always chosen to rise above it. His parents, hard-working people who had built a life for their family despite numerous obstacles, had taught him the power of dignity and resilience. "Don't let them take your peace," his mother had often said. Those words echoed in his mind now as he gently squeezed Sarah's hand, a silent reminder that Linda's words didn't define their worth. While Michael remained composed, Sarah was beginning to fray at the edges. She had always admired Michael's ability to stay calm in the face of ignorance, but her fiery personality made it difficult for her to follow his lead. "She doesn't know us," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with frustration. "She has no idea what we've worked for, what we've built together." Michael gave her a small, reassuring smile. "She doesn't matter," he said softly. "Let her think what she wants. We know who we are." Sarah nodded, but couldn't help glancing toward Linda, who was now speaking with exaggerated gestures to a fellow passenger. The other woman looked uncomfortable, offering polite nods without fully engaging, but Linda pressed on. The terminal began to buzz with low whispers. Passengers nearby were starting to notice Linda's behavior. Some shook their heads in quiet disapproval, while others looked away, unwilling to get involved. One man, seated a few rows away, muttered to his companion, "She's been going on about them for 10 minutes. It's ridiculous." A young woman with a baby on her lap offered Michael and Sarah an empathetic smile, as if to say, "I see what's happening, and I'm sorry." Still, no one intervened. It wasn't that they didn't care. Many did. But the invisible barrier of social discomfort kept them silent. For now, Linda's sharp voice dominated the space, her judgment hanging heavily in the air. As boarding time approached, the tension between Linda and the couple simmered, unspoken but palpable. Michael remained calm, his resolve unshaken, while Sarah took deep breaths, doing her best to follow his lead. Linda, on the other hand, continued to watch them like a hawk, her muttered comments growing louder as the boarding line began to form. To her, Michael and Sarah were an affront to her carefully curated world, a world where wealth and privilege were supposed to ensure separation from people like them. But Linda's world was about to be shaken in ways she couldn't imagine. The announcement for first-class boarding echoed through the terminal, prompting Michael and Sarah Taylor to rise from their seats. Michael adjusted the strap of his carry-on, while Sarah tucked their boarding passes into her purse with a smile. Finally, she said, nudging Michael playfully. Let's go enjoy this first-class experience. As they approached the gate, Linda Carter's sharp eyes followed their every move. Her expression hardened when the gate agent scanned their boarding passes and motioned them forward with a polite, "Enjoy your flight." Linda's thin lips pressed into a scowl, her irritation evident. She muttered to herself, loud enough for a few passengers nearby to hear, "I can't believe this. First class used to have standards." Michael and Sarah didn't look back. They walked down the jet bridge with their heads held high, determined to leave Linda's judgment behind them. The first-class cabin was pristine and inviting, with plush leather seats arranged in a spacious layout. Soft lighting and the faint hum of engines created a serene atmosphere, a welcome contrast to the tension in the terminal. Michael and Sarah found their seats near the window, a pair of premium recliners complete with extra legroom and built-in screens. Sarah grinned as she sank into her chair, running her hand over the smooth armrest. "This is so much better than economy," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. Michael chuckled, stowing their carry-ons in the overhead compartment. "Told you it'd be worth it," he said, taking the seat beside her. A flight attendant approached with a warm smile, offering a pre-flight drink menu. Sarah ordered a sparkling water, while Michael opted for a cranberry juice. As the attendant handed them their drinks, Sarah raised her glass with a cheeky smile. "Cheers," she said, clinking her glass lightly against Michael's, to ignoring ignorance and enjoying the moment. Michael smiled back, his calm presence a grounding force. "Cheers," he said softly, though a flicker of tension lingered in his eyes. Minutes later, the sound of heels clicking against the cabin floor signaled Linda's arrival. Her sharp gaze darted around the first-class cabin, scanning the faces of the seated passengers. When her eyes landed on Michael and Sarah, her lips curled into a sneer. Linda paused beside their row, her expression a mix of disbelief and indignation. "Of course," she muttered under her breath, loud enough to carry. The couple exchanged glances, Michael raising an eyebrow in silent communication. Sarah sighed, turning her attention to the window in an effort to ignore Linda's presence. Linda flagged down a flight attendant, her voice sharp and accusatory. "Excuse me," she said, gesturing toward Michael and Sarah. "Are you sure everyone here is supposed to be in first class?" The attendant blinked, her professional demeanor unwavering. "Yes, ma'am," she replied. "All passengers in this cabin have first-class tickets." "Well, that's hard to believe," Linda snapped. "First class used to mean something. Now it's just anyone, apparently." The attendant's polite smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "If there's an issue, ma'am, I'd be happy to assist you once you're seated." Linda's muttering continued as she made her way to her seat several rows behind Michael and Sarah. Passengers nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances, their expressions ranging from disapproval to outright annoyance. Michael leaned back in his seat, his hands resting on the armrests as he exhaled deeply. "She's not going to stop, is she?" he said, his voice low. Sarah shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "Probably not. But it's not about her. It's about us enjoying this moment." Michael nodded, his resolve steadying. He had faced people like Linda before, people who couldn't see beyond their own prejudices, and he knew better than to let their ignorance ruin what was meant to be a special experience. As the cabin crew began their pre-flight preparations, Michael and Sarah turned their focus to each other, their quiet conversation punctuated by soft laughter. Linda's glares and whispers remained in the background, a reminder of her bitterness, but not a distraction from their joy. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the tension in the cabin felt like a coiled spring. Linda's outrage simmered just beneath the surface, her expression one of barely concealed fury. She adjusted her scarf with exaggerated movements, her eyes darting toward Michael and Sarah as if searching for further proof of her misplaced assumptions. Meanwhile, the couple leaned into the comfort of their seats, their closeness a quiet act of defiance against Linda's hostility. Michael's hand rested lightly on Sarah's, a small but significant gesture of solidarity. The flight attendant returned, offering warm towels and checking on the passengers. When she stopped by Michael and Sarah's row, her smile seemed a touch brighter, her tone more genuine. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said warmly. "Thank you," Michael replied, his voice steady and kind. Linda's muttering had grown quieter, but her anger remained palpable. For Michael and Sarah, however, her hostility was just noise. The calm before the inevitable storm. The low hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin as the flight crew made final preparations for takeoff. Michael and Sarah Taylor were nestled in their first-class seats, exchanging light-hearted comments about their itinerary. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the tension from the gate and Linda's glares had melted away. But Linda Carter's frustration, simmering since the terminal, finally boiled over. She sat rigid in her seat a few rows behind the couple, her manicured fingers tapping furiously on the armrest. Her sharp gray eyes remained fixed on Michael and Sarah, and her thoughts festered with indignation. She couldn't take it anymore. Linda stood abruptly, startling the passengers in her row. Murmurs rippled through the cabin as she marched toward Michael and Sarah's seats, her heels clicking sharply against the carpeted aisle. The flight attendant nearest her glanced up, frowning slightly, but Linda didn't stop. "How can you even afford to sit here?" Linda demanded, her voice rising. Michael and Sarah turned, caught off guard by her sudden approach. Linda's face was flushed, her expression a volatile mix of outrage and disbelief. "This is first class," she continued, her words dripping with contempt. "People like you don't belong here. It's not fair to the rest of us who've earned this privilege." The cabin fell silent. Passengers and crew alike turned to watch the unfolding scene, their gazes bouncing between Linda's furious stance and the stunned couple in their seats. Michael exhaled slowly, his calm demeanor masking the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. He met Linda's glare with steady eyes, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, where we sit is none of your business," he said, his tone carrying an undercurrent of quiet authority. "But since you're so curious, we'll be happy to explain, after you return to your seat and let everyone enjoy their flight." Linda's mouth opened and closed in disbelief, as if she couldn't fathom his refusal to cower under her scrutiny. "Excuse me?" she spat, her voice rising another octave. "You think you can talk to me like that? I have every right to ask how you got here." Sarah shifted in her seat, her blue eyes narrowing as her patience wore thin. "We're here because we paid for these seats, just like everyone else," she said, her voice sharp. "Paid?" Linda scoffed, crossing her arms. "Don't make me laugh. Did you win a contest? Or maybe some charity decided to be generous?" A collective gasp rippled through the cabin, followed by murmurs of disbelief and outrage. Several passengers shook their heads, and one man muttered, "Unbelievable." A young woman a few rows back whispered to her companion, "Is she serious right now?" The flight attendants exchanged glances before one of them approached quickly, her professional smile replaced with a stern expression. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat immediately," she said firmly. Linda turned to the attendant, her indignation undeterred. "I'm just pointing out the obvious. They don't belong here, and everyone knows it." "Ma'am," the attendant repeated, her tone firmer, "this behavior is disruptive. If you don't return to your seat and remain quiet, I'll have to involve the captain." Instead of retreating, Linda doubled down. She pointed a manicured finger at Michael and Sarah, her voice now shaking with frustration. "This isn't right. I've flown first class for years, and I've never seen anything like this. People like them ruin the experience for the rest of us." Michael leaned back slightly, his calm exterior unwavering. "People like us?" he asked, his voice low but resonant. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" Linda faltered, her words stumbling out in a defensive rush. "You know what I mean. You don't belong. You're just out of place here." The cabin grew even quieter, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The flight attendant stepped between Linda and the couple, her eyes flashing with authority. "This is your final warning," she said, her voice low and controlled. "Return to your seat now, or I will have you removed from this flight." Linda hesitated, her face twisting in a mixture of anger and humiliation. Passengers around her began whispering louder, their disapproval palpable. "Do you hear them?" one woman called out from a few rows back. "Sit down and leave them alone." Linda glanced around, her flush deepening as she realized the tide of public opinion was against her. Still, she hesitated, her pride refusing to let her back down completely. Finally, with a huff of frustration, Linda threw her hands up and turned on her heel. She stomped back to her seat, her muttered complaints barely audible over the relieved sighs of the passengers. The flight attendant turned to Michael and Sarah, her expression softening. "I'm so sorry about that," she said gently. "If you need anything during the flight, please let us know." Michael nodded, offering a small, appreciative smile. "Thank you. We're fine." Sarah glanced at him, her frustration giving way to admiration for his composure. "I don't know how you stayed so calm," she whispered. Michael shrugged lightly. "People like her don't deserve our energy," he replied. "Let's just enjoy the flight." As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Linda sat stiffly in her seat, her arms crossed and her face set in a scowl. The rest of the cabin, however, relaxed into a sense of collective relief. For Michael and Sarah, the worst of the confrontation was over. But Linda had no idea the true impact of her behavior would hit her soon enough. The tension in the cabin lingered long after Linda Carter had stomped back to her seat, her muttered complaints still audible to those seated nearby. The flight attendants continued their rounds, their professional demeanor masking the frustration etched on their faces. It wasn't long before Linda's dissatisfaction bubbled to the surface again. With a dramatic sigh, she unbuckled her seatbelt and flagged down a flight attendant, her expression indignant. "Excuse me," she said sharply, pointing toward Michael and Sarah. "Are you sure they're supposed to be in first class? Because this is completely unacceptable." The young flight attendant, clearly nearing the end of her patience, managed a tight smile. "Ma'am, all passengers in first class have valid tickets. Now, I need you to remain seated as we're preparing for takeoff." Linda crossed her arms, her voice dripping with entitlement. "Then maybe you should check again. I've been a loyal first-class customer for years, and I've never seen anything like this. I think you've made a mistake." The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, then sighed, realizing Linda would not relent. "Fine, ma'am. May I see your ticket, please?" she said, her tone neutral but firm. Linda handed over her crumpled boarding pass with a huff, glaring toward Michael and Sarah as if they were the ones causing the inconvenience. The attendant glanced at the ticket and frowned, her brow furrowing slightly. "Ma'am," the attendant said, her voice careful, "your seat is actually in economy, not first class." The cabin went quiet, the collective tension now shifting to astonishment. Linda blinked, her face turning a shade of red that matched her perfectly manicured nails. "There must be some mistake," she sputtered. "I always fly first class." "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your ticket is for seat 24B in the main cabin," the attendant reiterated. "I need you to return to your assigned seat immediately." Embarrassment flared in Linda's expression, but it quickly twisted into indignation. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice growing louder. "I deserve to be in first class. I've earned it. And yet you let them sit here?" She jabbed a finger toward Michael and Sarah, her frustration bubbling over into outright hostility. "What kind of system is this? People like me should have priority over what?" Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through Linda's rant. The question hung in the air, forcing Linda to pause. Sarah's blue eyes locked onto Linda's with a fiery intensity, her patience finally worn thin. "If you're so worried about status," Sarah continued, her voice steady, "maybe you should check your own ticket before making assumptions about ours." Linda opened her mouth to retort, but Michael spoke before she could. His tone was calm but carried an edge of quiet authority. "In case you're wondering, my wife and I own a successful consulting firm," he said, his gaze steady and unwavering. "We've worked hard for everything we have, including these seats, and we're proud of it." The simplicity of his statement struck a chord. His words were neither boastful nor defensive, but they carried the weight of truth. Linda's mouth opened, then closed, as if she couldn't decide whether to argue or retreat. The color drained from her face as the reality of her assumptions set in. The silence that followed was broken by a soft ripple of murmurs, growing into quiet applause from a few nearby passengers. A man seated a row behind Michael and Sarah gave a small nod of approval. "Well said," he muttered, loud enough to be heard. Linda's face burned as she glanced around, realizing she had lost whatever support she thought she might have had. Her indignation deflated into humiliation, and she looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting nervously. The flight attendant, now more assertive, gestured toward the back of the plane. "Ma'am, please return to your assigned seat in economy. We need to proceed with takeoff. Linda hesitated, but the growing weight of the stairs around her left her no choice. With a final huff, she turned and walked down the aisle, her heels clicking against the carpet as she disappeared into the main cabin. Michael leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly as the tension in the cabin eased. Sarah turned to him, a small, satisfied smile on her face. "You handled that perfectly," she said softly. Michael gave a faint shrug, his expression calm. "Some people only see what they want to see," he said. "It's not our job to change their minds, but we don't have to let them walk over us either." The flight attendant returned to their row, her earlier frustration replaced with a genuine smile. "I'm so sorry for all of that," she said warmly. "If there's anything you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you," Michael replied, his voice kind but steady. As the plane began its taxi down the runway, Michael and Sarah sat side by side, their hands lightly touching. The murmurs of approval from the other passengers lingered in the background, a quiet affirmation of the couple's dignity and strength in the face of ignorance. For Linda, the rest of the flight would be spent in uncomfortable reflection. For Michael and Sarah, however, it was the beginning of a well-earned escape, one where their resilience had turned the tide. The first-class cabin settled into an uneasy calm as Linda Carter, still flushed from embarrassment, reluctantly followed the flight attendant's firm instruction. With a curt nod and a huff of indignation, Linda shuffled back toward the economy section, clutching her designer bag tightly. "Please remain seated for the duration of the flight," the attendant said, her voice polite but edged with authority. "And I must warn you, any further disruptions will result in immediate removal at the next stop." Linda froze mid-step, her head snapping around as if to protest, but the weight of the cabin's collective judgment silenced her. The murmurs and disapproving glances from the other passengers were impossible to ignore. Shoulders slumping slightly, she sank into her assigned seat in row 24, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. In first class, Michael and Sarah exchanged a quiet glance as the cabin resumed its normal rhythm. The hum of conversations returned, broken only by the occasional clink of glasses and the soft footsteps of the flight attendants. Sarah leaned closer to Michael, her voice low. "Can you believe that just happened?" Michael gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Unfortunately, yes," he replied. "But it's over now. Let's focus on enjoying the rest of the flight." Sarah nodded, exhaling deeply as she leaned back into the plush seat. Moments later, a flight attendant approached with a tray of complimentary desserts and warm towels. "On behalf of the crew," she said with a kind smile, "please enjoy these with our apologies for the earlier disturbance." Michael and Sarah accepted graciously, their calm composure standing in stark contrast to the earlier chaos. As they clinked glasses, Sarah raised her eyebrows playfully. "Cheers to rising above," she said, her smile returning. "Cheers," Michael echoed, his tone light but meaningful. Back in the economy cabin, Linda sat stiffly in her cramped seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her indignation simmered beneath the surface, but the humiliation she felt was undeniable. Every so often she glanced toward the front of the plane, her sharp gray eyes narrowing as if she could still see Michael and Sarah. But now her gaze was tinged with something new: self-consciousness. The whispers of the other passengers reached her ears, soft but cutting. What was she thinking? One voice murmured. "So entitled," said another. Linda shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. She avoided making eye contact with anyone, her usual confidence replaced by an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. For the first time in years, she found herself questioning not just her actions, but the beliefs that had led her here. As the plane began its descent, the atmosphere in the cabin grew lighter. The bustling energy of arrival replaced the earlier tension, and passengers started preparing for landing. Michael and Sarah gathered their belongings, their voices low as they discussed their plans for the vacation ahead. Linda lingered in her seat, watching as the other passengers moved around her. Her earlier arrogance had faded, leaving her with a hollow discomfort she couldn't quite shake. When the plane touched down, the usual shuffle to disembark began. Michael and Sarah waited patiently for their turn, their composure unbroken despite the earlier confrontation. As they stood to leave, Linda hesitated, then rose slowly from her seat. As the couple passed Linda's row on their way to the exit, she cleared her throat. The sound was barely audible over the shuffle of passengers, but Michael caught it. He turned slightly, his calm gaze meeting hers. Linda started, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. She glanced at Sarah, then back at Michael. I shouldn't have said what I said. It wasn't right. Her words hung in the air, faltering and incomplete. But the sentiment was clear. Michael gave a small nod, his expression measured but kind. Thank you, he said simply, his tone free of malice. Linda opened her mouth to say more but closed it again, her face reflecting a mix of regret and frustration. Michael and Sarah stepped off the plane, their hands intertwined as they walked through the bustling airport terminal. The weight of Linda's prejudice felt distant now, overshadowed by their quiet triumph. Sarah glanced at Michael, a smile spreading across her face. You know, she said, for someone who's so calm, you're awfully good at making a statement. Michael laughed softly, squeezing her hand. Sometimes the best statement is just being who you are, he said. Together they disappeared into the crowd, their love and resilience a testament to the strength of character over ignorance. Linda's behavior might have disrupted their journey, but it could never overshadow the life they had built together, or the dignity with which they faced the world. If this story inspired you, share it with others to spark meaningful conversations about kindness, resilience, and the importance of standing against prejudice. Let's work together to create a world where respect and dignity are extended to everyone, regardless of appearances or assumptions. Your voice can help make a difference. Spread the message today.